Detroit in the summer of 1970 had a particular kind of heat. Not just the weather, though that was brutal enough, the kind that made the asphalt soft and the air smell like metal. It was the heat of a city still raw from the riots 3 years earlier, still trying to figure out what it was becoming. And in the middle of all that, on West Grand Boulevard, sat a pale blue two-story house that didn't look like much from the outside. But inside Hitsville, USA, Motown Records ran like a machine that never cooled down. Everything at Motown had a system. Songs were rehearsed until the mistakes stopped, then rehearsed some more. Musicians were handed sheet music before they walked in the door. Arrangements were locked before anyone touched an instrument. Berry Gordy had built his empire on precision, on the idea that pop music wasn't art, it was a product, and products needed quality control. You didn't leave things to chance at Motown. You didn't improvise. You delivered on time exactly what was asked of you. Marvin Gaye had delivered for over a decade. He had sung what Gordy told him to sing. He had smiled in the photos they wanted, worn the tuxedos they preferred, kept the politics off the records. But by 1970, something in Marvin had quietly broken open. His brother Frankie had come back from Vietnam with hollow eyes and nightmares that made no sound. Black men were dying in a war and dying in the streets back home, and Motown was still asking Marvin to record dance records. He couldn't do it anymore. He had a new song, a collection of songs, actually, that sounded nothing like anything Motown had released. No bright horns, no polished choreography baked into the groove, just a slow, aching question aimed at the whole country. He called it, "What's Going On?" When Marvin played the demos for Gordy, the room went quiet in the wrong way. Gordy listened, arms crossed, and when the tape stopped, he said the song was uncommercial. He said it was too political, too loose, too unlike what Marvin Gaye was supposed to be. He told Marvin that Motown had spent years building a crossover audience, white listeners, mainstream radio, and a record about Vietnam and poverty and police brutality would burn all of that down. "This isn't what we do," Gordy said. "This isn't you." Marvin didn't argue. He just picked up his things and left the office. But he didn't go home. He went to Studio A. The walk from Gordy's office to the studio floor at Hitsville was short. A few hallways, a flight of stairs, less than 2 minutes. But Marvin had made that walk hundreds of times over the course of his career, and this time it felt different. Every session before this one had begun with some version of permission. A song approved, a schedule confirmed, a producer assigned. He was walking in without any of that now. No approval, no oversight, no safety net. Just a record he believed in and a room with the equipment to make it. He didn't have a session booked. He didn't have clearance. He walked in, told the engineer to set up, and started making calls to the musicians he wanted in the room. The session wasn't on any official Motown schedule, which meant no one from upstairs was watching. For once, Marvin was going to make exactly the record he wanted to make and figure out the consequences later. The musicians started filtering in around midday. Some of them knew each other from years of Motown sessions, nodded hello, set up their gear. One of them was a saxophone player named Eli Fontaine. Fontaine had been playing in Detroit studios for the better part of a decade. He was the kind of musician you needed but didn't necessarily notice. Technically clean, showed up on time, never caused problems. His name wasn't on the records he played on. That was just how it worked for session musicians. You came in, you did your job, you took your check, you went home. Fontaine was good at his job in the way that made him invisible. He had played on records that sold millions. He had stood in rooms where history was being made and had no idea. The saxophone lines people hummed on the street, in grocery stores, in their cars with the windows down. Some of those were his. He didn't get credit. He didn't expect it. That was the agreement, written or not, that session musicians made when they walked through the door of a place like Motown. You were a component. You made the machine run. The machine didn't put your name on the box. He walked into Studio A that afternoon, hung up his jacket, and opened his saxophone case. The room was still getting set up. Notes hadn't been passed around yet. Nobody was ready to start. So Fontaine did what saxophone players do when there's nothing else to do. He sat down, wet his reed, raised the horn to his lips, and played. Not a song, not the session material, Just a few notes to open his lungs. A slow, wandering phrase that went somewhere for a moment and then dissolved. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Completely unrehearsed, completely unintentional. In the control room, engineer Ken Sands was still getting his levels sorted. He had the tape machine loaded and was running through his setup checklist. At some point, he would never be entirely sure exactly when, he hit the record button without meaning to. Maybe he was reaching for something else. Maybe his hand slipped. The tape started rolling, and Fontaine's warm-up notes were caught on it. Nobody knew. Fontaine set his horn down and stretched his neck. Sands kept adjusting his board. The session hadn't officially started. Then Marvin walked into the control room. He glanced at the board, noticed the transport moving, and frowned. "Did you just record something?" Sands started to apologize. It was an accident. He'd just caught a few seconds of Fontaine warming up. Nothing useful. He'd rewind and clear it. Marvin held up a hand. "Play it back." Sands rewound the tape and hit play. The room filled with those 3 or 4 seconds. Fontaine's unplanned melody, loose and searching, the kind of phrase no one writes down because there's nothing to write. It sounded like a man thinking out loud, like the beginning of a feeling that hadn't found its words yet. Marvin stood very still. "Again!" Sands played it back. Then again. Then again. He played it 7 or 8 times while Marvin stood at the glass and looked out at the studio floor without saying anything. The other musicians were starting to notice. A couple of them exchanged a glance. Finally, Marvin walked out of the control room and into the studio. He crossed the floor slowly and stopped in front of Eli Fontaine. "All right, Eli," he said. "You can go home." Fontaine stared at him. He had just arrived. He hadn't played a single note of the actual session material. He hadn't even looked at the arrangements yet. "Marvin," he said carefully, "I was just warming up. I haven't even started." "I know," Marvin said. "That's why you can go." The room was very quiet. Nobody wanted to be the one to say something. Fontaine looked at Marvin for a long moment, trying to read his face, and then packed up his saxophone, put on his jacket, and walked out. He would spend the entire drive home wondering if he'd done something wrong, if he'd somehow offended Marvin, if his career at Motown was finished. He didn't understand what had just happened. He wouldn't understand it for another year. The rest of the session continued without him. Marvin worked through the arrangements, recorded the vocals, layered the parts the way he heard them in his head. Looser than anything Motown had released. More open, more honest. But he kept coming back to that tape. Kept asking Sands to play back those 3 seconds between takes. The other musicians noticed but said nothing. There was something in Marvin's focus that made people reluctant to interrupt. When it came time to assemble the final recording, Marvin told Sands he wanted to use it. That warm-up. That accidental breath of melody at the very beginning, before the song officially started. Sands looked at him carefully. It was a mistake recording, an artifact. Standard practice would be to cut it out. "That's the point," Marvin said. "Leave it in." Getting the record released was its own fight. Gordy had already said no once. When Marvin brought him the finished tapes, Gordy listened and said no again. Too political. Too different. Not what Motown did. Marvin had heard that before. This time his answer was different. He told Gordy that if Motown wouldn't release what's going on, he was done. No more recording, no more touring, no more albums. Gordy could take that however he wanted. It was a gamble that could have ended everything. Marvin was one of Motown's biggest artists, but he also had no real leverage. Gordy had built the machine, and the machine could run without any single part. What Marvin had was the certainty that this record was right, not commercially calculated, not strategically positioned, just right in a way he couldn't fully explain and didn't need to. Gordy released it in May 1971. He later admitted he thought it would fail. It didn't fail. What's Going On became one of the best-selling records in Motown's history. Critics who had been writing about soul music for years struggled to explain what made it different. The feeling of it, the way it moved. Rolling Stone called it a masterpiece. Radio stations that Gordy had been so worried about played it constantly. A whole generation of listeners heard something in it that they hadn't heard before. A record that wasn't trying to sell them anything, wasn't trying to make them forget their problems. A record that was just asking the question out loud. And the first thing they heard every single time was those 3 or 4 seconds. Fontaine's warm-up, the accident, that unplanned, unrehearsed, in-between moment that Marvin had recognized before anyone else in the room understood what they were looking at. In 2004, Eli Fontaine gave an interview where someone finally asked him about it directly. He laughed, a short, surprised laugh, like the questions still caught him off guard even decades later. He said he thought about that afternoon a lot, about walking out to his car, not knowing what had happened, about turning on the radio a year later and hearing that intro come out of the speaker. He said, "I finally understood why he sent me home. If I'd stayed in that room, I would have tried to play it again. I would have tried to do it on purpose, and it never would have been the same." There's a version of that story where nothing goes wrong, where Sands doesn't hit the wrong button, where Fontaine warms up in the hallway, where that 3-second phrase disappears into the air and no one ever hears it. That version exists in some parallel Detroit, in some parallel summer, and in that version, what's going on probably still gets made. Marvin was going to finish that record one way or another, but it opens differently. It starts on purpose. What Marvin understood, standing at that glass and watching the tape counter move, was that some moments can't be manufactured. You can practice for 20 years and still not produce the thing that a man creates when he's just breathing, just existing, just warming up with nowhere to be. The genius wasn't in playing the note. The genius was in knowing, immediately without any doubt, that the note was already done. The question that record keeps asking, more than 50 years later, is still the right one. And it starts before the words even begin. Have you ever created something by accident that turned out to be the best thing you ever made? Tell us in the comments.